Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. Also, a very warm welcome to those who are joining us online. I'm Ian Lesser from GMF here in Brussels. GMF's mission is very simply to strengthen transatlantic cooperation in the spirit of the Marshall Plan. The climate security nexus, which is our theme today, affects all of us in profound ways, and it's front and center on our agenda. It is a particular pleasure to have with us an extraordinary group of leaders today from institutions playing a key role on security, geopolitics, climate policy, the nexus as we've described it. Josep Borrell, High Representative of the European Union for Foreign and Security Policy, John Kerry, U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, Frans Timmermans, Executive Vice President of the European Commission, and Heather Graby, Senior Advisor at the Open Society Foundations, who will moderate our conversation. Thank you all of us for taking the time. Thank you from all of us for taking the time to be with us today. We look forward to the conversation up here, but also in the room. And Heather, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian, and to German Marshall Fund for organising this event. This is a historic moment when we have the representatives of 4 different institutions taking climate security very seriously in the middle of a hot war in Europe. It shows long-term thinking. It also shows breadth of understanding that climate changes everything. So we have an opportunity both to hear them speak among themselves about where climate security is going in Europe, what the institutions of the EU, NATO and the United States can do about it, and also to hear your feedback and questions about climate security. What is it and how can it be embedded in policies across the spectrum? So we're going to start with Secretary General Stoltenberg. You've been a pioneer on climate and security even before you began your NATO role, and you've managed to put it at the heart of the NATO agenda. And now we have a war going on the European continent. So why is it so necessary for military security to have climate security?
I will answer that question in a moment, but let me just start by thanking Ian Lesser, the German Marshall Fund, and also for you, Heather, for convening us and for hosting this event, because it is actually a special event. You have 4 men in their best age, but representing very heavy and important institutions, and then addressing the future, climate change, which is so important for our future. And I'm glad that we just are here together and demonstrating that unity and that commitment. Yes, there's a hot war going on in Europe, but NATO has to address climate change because NATO cannot remain a fossil fuel alliance in the age of renewables. And the war in Ukraine has actually demonstrated how energy climate change is linked to our security, because President Putin used energy, the gas, to try to coerce NATO allies from providing support to Ukraine. So it demonstrates the link between energy, climate change, and security. Climate change matters for our security, therefore it matters for NATO, and therefore we have put climate change much higher on the NATO agenda over the last couple of years. Then it's not enough only to say that this is a problem, we have to try to do something with it. And let me just briefly mention 3 areas where we actually are now addressing climate change as NATO. First, we need to mitigate. We need to reduce emissions, because if you look at battle tanks, warships, the big bombers, there are many things, but they're not very climate friendly. They consume a lot of fossil fuels, and they emit a lot. So if we're going to reach global net zero, we need also to reduce the quite substantial emissions from military activities, which takes also place in peacetime. I returned yesterday from the biggest ever air exercise in NATO in Germany, and of course we emitted a lot of CO2 with all those planes flying in the air. So therefore we need to develop the technology. We have an innovation fund, we have a center of excellence in Canada on climate change, and allies have started to step up to find ways to reduce emissions without reducing the effectiveness of our military capabilities. Because if allies are forced to choose between a climate-friendly green battle tank or a strong battle tank, they will choose the strong battle tank. So the only way to make this happen is to reconcile the need for climate-friendly, but also with also military effectiveness in the different capabilities. Things are moving in the right direction. We have some tools. We're investing more in technology. Second, we need to adapt, because global warming changed our security environment. More competition over scarce resources, land, water, millions of people forced to flee, but also the military, they operate outside. And more flooding, more extreme weather, more heat waves will affect everything from uniforms to doctrines to equipment. So we need to just, or rising sea levels affect a large portion of NATO naval bases. So we need to change the way we actually conduct military operations. And thirdly, we need to ensure that we don't create new vulnerabilities. Because we saw how vulnerable we were when we were too dependent on Russian gas. And now we welcome the transition that the EU is leading on moving from Russian gas to other and more sustainable energy resources, to solar, to wind, to electricity, to batteries. The only problem is that we, by doing that transition that we all support, risk creating new vulnerabilities on rare earth minerals from China. So we should not make the same mistake once again. And therefore, we need, as allies, as EU, as NATO, to work on how to increase our own production of rare earth minerals, and how to find other technologies that doesn't make us too overdependent on Chinese rare earth minerals. The last thing is just to say that when we do this, when we implement the transition, we need to be green and we need to be together. Because if we end up that some allies have electric battle tanks and others have fossil fuel, we will not be able to do what is one of NATO's core tasks, interoperability, that we can charge and fuel across nations and allies. So this is just highlights the importance of NATO as a platform where we set the standards, as we have always done, ensure interchangeability and interoperability, to then reconcile the need for a strong alliance with a green and climate-friendly alliance. And therefore it's a great pleasure to work with the United States, EU, and all the others who are supporting these efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that overview of why it matters for the military and future conflicts. I'd like to turn now to you, Executive Vice President Timmermans, to talk about the nature of the risks, the kinds of threats. There will be a joint communication that you will present with High Representative Borrell at the end of this month, the first time that the EU will put forward its view on climate security and how to proceed. So what kinds of risks will it address? We've got used to the idea that decarbonisation has to happen. We've got used to the idea that temperatures are rising. I mean, we can feel it even today here in Brussels. But there's an awful lot else that's still on the agenda to do with nature, biodiversity, and so on. How do those feed into the new concept of climate security?
Well, thank you for your question, Heather. But first of all, let me thank my co-panelists for not holding my younger age and lack of experience against me. What I wanted to say is this. There's a recent book written by Professor Peter Frankopan, where he describes earlier climate crises in human history. And when climate change came about, it was always very slow. Now it's going extremely fast. But even the slow climate change had profound effect on human behavior. It led to huge migrational flows, it led to wars, it led to technological disruptions, etc., etc. So what we need to understand is that what happened then is happening now, but on steroids. To give you a few examples, the disappearance of permafrost in the north of Russia has a huge impact on their hydrocarbon industry, huge impact. But it also has a huge impact on geostrategic choices. You know, if shipping is possible there, what does that mean for our security? The fact that parts of Africa risk becoming unlivable because of high temperatures has a huge impact on migrational flows. You know, we're talking about countries where the average age is below 20. And these people are not going to sit there and die. They're going to look for a better place to go. So migration will have a huge influence on everything we do. Food production. The commodity that will be probably most fought over in the future is water. Who would have thought that a decade ago, that water would be a more rare commodity than oil or gas? So the challenges are many-faceted, but they all affect NATO. They all affect our collective security, and they're all in the area of Europe somehow, in some way or form. I wanted to end on something that perhaps shouldn't end on a negative note, but I have to. Every time we get new scientific facts, they're more pessimistic than the previous facts. I would like to see one scientific report coming to us saying, oh, it's not as bad, it's going better. Every time the news is worse. And so we have no time to lose. And if we can, we have different constituencies. Some people are very much in this because they want to protect nature. Others are in this because they know that for their businesses they need a decent climate policy. But the constituency of security has not been really brought into this yet in a way that is consistent. And I really salute the Biden administration for taking that initiative, for holding these meetings in the White House. For the first time, a US administration is doing this. And for the first time, they're making a consistent analysis of these threats and opting in the scientific community to help us understand these threats better. And I think in Europe, we should do this, and this is very much the basis of the analysis Pepe and I have made.
Excellent. Thank you. So, Secretary Kerry, you're the presidential envoy, special envoy for climate. So you've been trying to do a whole-of-government, interagency approach to climate, to security, to US policy. How's that going? How easy is it, and how have you found ways of bringing all kinds of parts of government who think that climate is not really their business on board and getting them to implement policies?
I was going to say, how do you think it's going?
We'll come to that later.
Well, first of all, a profound thank you to the Truman Marshall Fund, and what a privilege to be here with President Borrell and also with Jens Stoltenberg, who I think has just been doing a superb job pulling NATO together and setting an example of leadership. It's terrific. And this fellow is my longtime friend. We three amigos met in Munich at the Munich Security Conference this last year, and we all agreed in an early morning breakfast very quickly that we needed to do this, to come together to make certain people understood that climate crisis, it is a crisis, is not some political strategy conjured up by people who want to mobilize people to do something. It is, if not the single one of two or three most serious security issues we face on this planet. I had the privilege of being in Rome on Monday morning and meeting with the Holy Father, Pope Francis, and his eloquence and his concern. He was a man who just came out of an operation and is in amazing recovery. But his concern was for humanity, as it always is, and our lack of willingness to acknowledge and act on the facts that we see and that we know are happening. And all around the world, I mean, Frans just talked about it, it comes at us again and again, bigger and faster. The evidence could not be more powerful, but what we have to get done. But there is too much business as usual, too much greed, too much unwillingness to sort of embrace the realities of the future that we're looking at. And I mean a future where there are extraordinary economic opportunities. This is the biggest economic transformation we're looking at since the Industrial Revolution. And the opportunity through these new technologies to have people working at really interesting and cleaner and better paying jobs is right there staring us in the face. The transition happens because we build out new grids. We put into place new forms of energy provision, whether it's hydrogen or ammonia or take shipping. We just talked about shipping. If it were a country, is the 8th largest emitter in the world. But they're now recognizing they've got to change. So there are countless ships. Maersk is stepping up and building some 18, 19 methanol-capable ships. And ultimately, they're going to be building ships, all of them. Yara, MSC have all agreed to build carbon-neutral ships. So how is it going? There's an amazing amount of energy which is going into these new technologies and this transformation, but not enough. Not at a scalable level, not yet the amount of money that's needed to invest that we know has to come according to the UN and others. So we have to kick ourselves into much higher gear, recognizing that the security connection of this could not be more significant. The security is everything, folks. I mean, your health security, energy security, food security, political and social structural security. If you have a global South that cannot live where they work and cannot work where they live, you're going to have people who are going to move and find another place. And if you think Syria upset the equilibrium of Europe with respect to migration, wait till you see what happens when tens of millions of people have been left in a place where they literally cannot survive unless they move. Some of that movement is already happening today. Latin America, Africa, other places. We see it. We've just seen it with boat after boat that tips over and children are drowned and people who desperately want a better life are drowned. I mean, it's incomprehensible to me that people don't make this connection, but they don't yet. That's why we have embarked on this effort to make sure people understand you don't have security, not any kind of security whatsoever, unless you deal with the climate crisis. And it will cost far more money by every economic analysis to try to do this late when it is too late. And we know from the best scientists in the world, we may already be at 5 tipping points. The coral reefs of the oceans, the Barents Sea, the permafrost, which releases unbelievable methane, and that methane is 20 to 80 times more destructive than CO2. And then, of course, the 2 big ones, Arctic and Antarctic. So if we're going to be serious and not join on silently to some unspoken suicide pact, we need to be smarter, more engaged, take action, and embrace this incredible, cleaner, safer, healthier set of possibilities that are waiting on the other side of this transition. We lose 8 million, according to the World Health Organization, we lose 8 million people a year. They die because of just the air quality. Air pollution is what it's called. Greenhouse gas air pollution. So it's time to get smart in terms of the definition of security and the way we do the things necessary to be secure. And it's time to set the planet on this unbelievably exciting set of possibilities that come with this economic transformation.
Well, thank you for setting out all the threats, but also for a new kind of threat that has really energized and motivated the Europeans, which is FOMO. The fear of missing out that has come with the Inflation Reduction Act has produced a flurry of responses on the European side, which perhaps we can come on to in terms of thinking about whether these policies will be adequate to address climate change. But I think it's a very interesting what you said about clean tech opportunities. This is also something that is an important part of the debate in explaining systems.
Can I just say to you quickly? Because I know this is an issue, and we all hear about it, obviously. President Biden believes, as Ursula von der Leyen has said publicly, that we don't have to be so competitive with each other here. We can work with each other and move forward because we all need to be deploying faster. China, let me say to all of you, China is deploying somewhere in the vicinity of 3,000 or so gigawatts of power that's renewable. None of us, all put together, are close to that. So we need to be seizing the initiative here to work together. I believe we will work out kinks within the IRA. And by the way, Europe has this amazing fund that you all were clever enough to put together, built on a trading system, which distributes a significant amount of money to each of your nation-state members, which can go directly into exactly the same thing that we're doing. So our plea is welcome aboard. Let's all do this together and move faster into this transition. And I know we'll work out. The President is keenly focused on respecting our friendship, our alliance, and making sure we're working together to move in the same direction.
Okay. Thank you. So just coming back to foreign and security policy, High Representative, it would be great if you could give us some examples, some thoughts about regions of the world where foreign and security policies really need to adapt and change in order to meet the climate security threat, but also the challenge of developing new kinds of relationships. Over to you.
Well, thank you for reminding that apart from foreign policy, I am also in charge of building security. And as John has said, the concept of security is shifting very quickly. There is new dimensions of security. Until now, security was related with war. Security against someone who wants to attack me. And I need to have tanks and cannons and trenches and bunkers. Well, security today is something much more complex. We are insecure for different reasons. And we are insecure due to the climate. And the figures are appalling. If you take the 20 more vulnerable countries in the world, and the less developed to face the climate change, the less prepared, 13 of them are in big conflict on the last 5 years. They are fighting. And when people are fighting, climate change is not the most important and prioritarian issue to take care of. And this fight is mainly due to the fact that resources are scarce, and they are scarce due to climate change. According to the United Nations, since 2008, every year, 20 million of people had to leave their houses due to climate accidents, due to droughts, due to floods, due to heat waves. And the number is increasing. In 2008, Javier Solana produced a report saying climate change is a crisis multiplier. It's a threat multiplier. And that's true. It's completely true. And in order to face this, we have to be aware that we will have more instability, more geopolitical competition, less access to resources. I'm coming from Egypt, and I can tell you that there the water issue and what's happening with the Ethiopian dam and what's happening with Nile bases is the first and most important issues. And you have a look at two examples in order to be concrete. Let's talk about Sahel and the Arctic. Sahel because it's related with the topical image of migrants living because of the heating. No? They cannot work on their land, they live. Sahel is a typical example, certainly, where climate change creates conflicts and insecurity on a wider region, much bigger than Europe. And their climate change is crazy much quicker, 1.5 times quicker than here in Europe. And certainly, the conflict between farmers and herders will certainly make a lot of people living. They are already doing that. 1.1 million people on the last 3 years, 1.1 million people have left. And where they are going to go? Imagine. Not difficult to imagine. So what are we doing in front of that? We have to engage more with them. We have started deploying environmental advisors in all these countries and all our missions in order to try to identify the effects of the climate on migration and terrorism, because it's a vicious circle, you know. The more people lose their capacity to live, the more they look for other ways of living, which are mostly related with a machine gun, creating militias and attacking the neighbor. And the terrorism is spreading from the Sahel to the Gulf of Guinea, and it's mostly related with the fact that temperatures make soil impossible to be work, and people have to live, not only in the Sahel, but in all our CSDP missions, we will have climate advisors, and we will put that in front, for the front of our cooperation. Arctic people don't relate security, climate, and Arctic. They prefer the image of the migrant living from a desert. But look, in the Arctic is a new geopolitical frontier. It's an increasing role played by Russia, by India and China, with new lanes and new resources, oil, gas, coal, minerals, and land, and new shipping routes. And these new shipping routes will lead to competition and increased security problems, because soon it's 2 weeks less to go from China to Europe through the usual route than going through the Arctic, because you will be able to navigate through the Arctic. And Alaska will be much closer to China. Geographically, it's the same distance, but this distance now can be navigated. And we have seen China sending Navy vessels to the region. And Russia is building a wide range of military assets in the Arctic. And we have to have a look at that, my dear friend, because the Arctic is becoming the new geopolitical space. And we have to be sure that this renewed interest in the Arctic follows international rules and is not being pushed by the strategic view of this is a new place to move, a new place to have warships. And this is happening. And also new population, because certainly for the Sahara, the climate change is a death sentence. But for the Siberia, it's an opportunity, because it will be much more easy to live there. So we have to be very much aware of these different geographical places where the climate has an effect that affects our security through different ways and means. Let's stop here.
Thank you. This Arctic issue is actually a fantastic example of how much climate changes the nature of security issues. As I understand it, there is no NATO member, including the United States, that has an icebreaker, for example, whereas Russia has them, China, I think even Korea is building one. So it changes not only the nature of the threats, but also the kinds of responses that are needed. But all of this can sound really quite abstract to citizens who are concerned about the cost of living, they're concerned about immediate threats like the war that's going on, they're concerned also about just how they deal with things right now. And it's tricky often to explain why investments in this whole transition are needed. It was one of the Gilets jaunes protesters put it in the protests in France against rising fuel prices. You know, the elites, they worry about the end of the world, we worry about the end of the month. So how do we embed these threats and these challenges into security policies in ways that citizens can actually feel the difference in their daily lives, can understand why this is necessary for them, given the immediate challenges, and just not having had to deal with this before? Perhaps you'd like to start, Frans.
Well, first of all, I don't think there are many citizens that need to be convinced that we're in a climate crisis anymore. I think this is felt all across the world. If I give you one example, my recent visit to India, the attitude the Indian government took towards me was completely different than 2 years earlier. 2 years earlier is, you've had your time, our time is still coming, don't talk to us about mitigating our emissions. That's changed, because they're faced with so many erratic weather events. Monsoon coming 2 months earlier, floods, droughts. They're extremely worried about the Himalayas and disappearance of glaciers and what that means for their water. All of that has come to the fore in the last couple of years. We should have seen these signs coming many, many years ago, but here we are. And so I don't think, if we are able to link, to avoid our citizens falling into despair, and I think we're very close to despair right now, closer than feels comfortable, and to show to them that we actually have answers, and these answers are affordable because we can mobilize a lot of private funding as well. And another step, convince them that not looking for the answers is going to be much more expensive and much more difficult if we don't do it now. Then I think we have a chance of getting public support for this. The one thing, you know, I don't want to sound too Marxist, but nostalgia has become the opium of the people. And so it's very easy in Europe to offer a political platform based on nostalgia, saying, well, you know, ethno-nationalism will save us, we'll take you back to the past, make America great again, and then nobody tells you which America was so great. But anyway, all these things play into this because it gives people an option to not look at the future. And we need, and people don't want to look at the future if they're despairing, if they don't think the future has anything on offer for them. So we need to be able to show that this can be a successful policy. And we also need to have, early successes in all of this. The fact, if I look at a country like Poland, the fact that so many private citizens decided to install solar panels has had a huge positive effect on how they see attacking the climate crisis. And this is happening in many, many, many countries. So we need to look for rays of light. We need to look for optimistic developments. And then that has to be part of a long-term framework. That's what we're doing with the European Green Deal. And that's what the well-named Inflation Reduction Act is doing in the US. And it's galvanizing public support, and it's galvanizing private investment. And without private investment, we're never going to get there.
So, John, is there a way that you could build bipartisan support for climate action based on security as the guiding concept? You've talked a lot about the need for carrots, the need for the private sector to take the lead, the need to build the business case for climate action. But are there ways also of persuading both parties in Congress that this is good for the American way of life? That it doesn't just move away from a fossil fuel-driven prosperity, which is very familiar to most Americans. How would you see the narrative changing in the US?
Well, I'm not sure that I do see it changing yet sufficiently fast. The tools of the politician and the diplomat are the policies we can frame with our words and offer people. I think we have offered people a very reasonable path with respect to dealing with the climate crisis, and no action is not reasonable. There was not one vote in the other party for the IRA, not one. Nor have we seen the other party yet standing up and articulating the challenge of this crisis of climate. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend that any one person has, I'm not sure what the formula is going to be. I don't know if you look out there and you see Lake Powell and Lake Mead that feed the Hoover Dam, which for the first time since 1937 couldn't produce electricity last year, does that not motivate you? When you see Houston yesterday, I think it was 41 or something, it was centigrade, I mean, just massive temperature increases, not this heat dome over the US right now. They don't quite see it going away very soon, and it's going to have profound implications. So our hope is we do not want this issue politicized. We have bent over backwards, and we've done the same with China as we work with China to try to bring China on board. We can, none of us, solve this problem without China being at the table and helping. They are 30% of all the emissions of the world. We are 10. And I'm proud to say going down, and we will meet our 50% target. I have no question about that, as will Europe, by the way. But we have others that have got to join it because one or two of those nations wipe out all the gains of the others if they're not reducing emissions fast enough. So we're not doing, we're not pointing fingers. We're not trying to engage in a tit for tat or anything. Nothing to do with politics. Everything we are doing right now is based on mathematics, physics, a little bit of chemistry and biology. That's what it's all about. And make no mistake, folks, this is not a rocket science challenge to try to figure out what's going on. There's one thing doing this: unabated emissions. Emissions of fossil fuel because of the way we decide to still drive cars, the way we decide to heat our homes, light our buildings, power. Power, transportation are two of the biggest elements of what is happening, and heavy industry relies on that. So if we don't capture the emissions, we don't win the battle. Or end the emissions, not capture them, end them. Those are the options. And unfortunately, we don't have the bipartisan majority yet that will move in the direction. We have to move so much faster than we're moving now. When World War II ended, we learned that one of the key elements of ending it really took place in the 2 or 3 years leading up to 1945. And Professor Paul Kennedy at Yale has written a book called The Engineers of Victory. And he wrote about the mid-level and other decisions that were made to gain superiority in the air, to gain superiority of the seas, to be able to break through the fortress along the coast of France and here and other places. And that happened. It didn't happen because we didn't take on the fight. That, at the end of the war, we learned that we were turning out one B-24 bomber every hour. We were deploying 3 Liberty ships every 2 days. Are we doing the same with solar panels? Are we doing the same with... Yeah, I know. That's exactly the challenge. So I hope that we will end any partisan talk and come together around the most reasonable set of choices you could have in public life.
Just one sentence, because the issue here is that both in the US and Europe, there are attempts to draw the climate crisis into the cultural wars. And if this becomes part of the cultural wars, it will paralyze us all. So we have a collective responsibility to insist on the fact that this transcends political differences. This is about our survival. It should not be part of the cultural wars.
Yeah, it's a huge risk of the green wedge, that climate becomes a political football, replacing in some respects, for example, migration, which you've all mentioned, as one of the key wedge issues between parties. So how to keep the member states together? Is the security framing helpful in ensuring that the 27 EU member states think about the foreign and security policy implications, and they're not just driven by domestic politics and also by the resistance of a lot of citizens in Europe who are concerned about what the transition means for them, and who are seeking guarantees of their financial security, what's going to happen to my job, and so on. How would you see using the security framing as a means of keeping the member states on track?
Well, it's not so easy, and certainly it's not the security issue which is more present on the debate. When people talk about migration, they consider their security, our security. They don't take into consideration the security that these people have been facing and the insecurity that has pushed them to leave. So we have to start thinking about the concept of a climate refugee, people who is escaping the consequences of the climate change. They are not coming here because they are not pursued politically, but because there is a threat that threatens their lives. Are we prepared culturally to understand that? I doubt it. But what is important, since we are talking about climate and security, to make permanently the link on the unsecurity that climate change is creating, on the places where people are more vulnerable. And we cannot understand the situation of, I put again the example of the Sahel, but I can't talk about the Corn of Africa, without understanding that it's climate change which is creating this move of the people. And here in Europe also people will move from the south to the north, because the south is becoming hotter. And we are used to the Europeans going to the south to take banned sun. Maybe it's too much now. And people will start thinking that they are fresher in the north. So we are moving also inside, but in a framework of a relative comfort. We can go to the south or to the north, but thanks God our living conditions continue being good. The problem with the insecurity issue is that it brings to war. It brings to war. That's what I want to bring to your attention. It's not that you are uncomfortable, it's that you have to go to fight in order to survive. To survive with the neighbor who has a camel, and you don't want his camel to eat the grass, and there is no more grass. To fight for water among countries, to build them and take the water for them, and downstream people say, hey, look, this water belongs to me, so either you stop keeping the dam for you, or we'll attack the dam. talking about attacking dams, no? Not only in Ukraine. And this kind of insecurity is widespreading in countries which are much more vulnerable than us, and they don't feel responsible for climate change. I'm sure Frank knows a lot about it, and immediately comes the issue of loss and damages and who caused it. And in Latin America, people tell you, look, Latin America as a whole, I am not wrong, it's responsible for the 3% of the accumulated emissions. 3% of the accumulated emissions. We are not responsible for anything. While you are much better. So the effort, the economic effort to finance adaptation has to be considered as urgent as to produce Liberty ships during the World War. And on that, at least that we can say that we Europeans, we have done our part. Because of the 100,000 billion that we promised to the developing world, Europe has, as far as I know, has been contributing with more than 25, between 25 and 30 billion, which is our share, taking into account our GDP. And this has to be considered as an expenditure that has to be as a war effort. When we talk about war economy, and with Ukrainian war makes us to think on war. This is not a war fighting each other with arms, but this, some people do that. Some people fight against each other due to the effects of the climate. And we have to come quicker. Peacekeeper today cannot be understood without taking into account the root causes of the conflict. And the root causes of the conflict is not because these guys are bad guys. It's because climate change pushes. And you know, the other day I was with an African minister who told me, it's not that we don't share the same values. We share the same values. Stop talking to me about values. We share the same values. What we don't share is the same priorities. And this is the question. The priority, we have to make them understand, and us understand with respect to them, that this is a matter of priority too. This is a matter of priority too. No?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'd like to open it up to the floor, so think about your question to ask. But just before we do that, I just want to ask one last question. So, yes, you talked a lot about the temperature rise in particular and the way that climate is driving many challenges for the military. It's also a conflict driver. It raises new kinds of conflicts. And I just would like to know what you think about the role of environmental degradation in this. We talk about climate change, but of course, even if, say, carbon emissions stopped tomorrow, even if we stopped the global temperature rise, we are already seeing collapse of biodiversity in places. We're seeing the loss of nature in ways that bring up new risks. How do you think about bringing that broader set of environmental risks into security planning?
No, I think that's part of the challenge, and obviously part of the problem, that we don't only speak about rising temperatures, but also about degradation of nature and biodiversity more in general. And that's partly caused by climate change, but also partly caused by other things. And of course that adds to climate change and environmental degradation as a crisis multiplier. But to be honest, for me, we have more than enough proof that this is a problem. So we can have new reports and new science and new research documenting something we already know, that climate change is dangerous. So the problem is not that. A few years ago, it was actually not so many years ago, there was an issue whether climate change was something to concern about, whether it was a human activity that caused climate change. Now I feel that there's a quite broad consensus that this is the problem. So now the issue is not to describe the problem and to document the problem. The challenge is, what do we do? And first of all, I would like to praise also both what John Kerry and the Biden administration has done and is doing in the United States. That's really great, because they're investing a lot in new technology. And also the EU, both on what they do in promoting the development of new technology, but also the way they price carbon emissions. Also in my previous position as Prime Minister of Norway, we worked hard for pricing carbon. I think that's the easiest, the best way of addressing this. And at that stage, I didn't dream about the carbon price. So I think it's 80 euros or something. 100 euros. Of course, 100 euros that makes a huge difference. Because then suddenly it becomes commercial to invest in carbon capture, in hydrogen, in solar panels, and all the other things. And that is what we need, because we have the technology. What we lack is volume and speed, because the timeline matters, and the volume of how much of these renewables we're actually able to deliver. And you mentioned the issue about ordinary people are concerned about next month. We are concerned about
the end of the world.
The end of the world. Well, so first of all, I think actually also a lot of ordinary people are concerned about the heat waves and the obvious proof that climate change is taking place now. Second, we should, I think, try to have a more positive message. There are many problems, but there are also a lot of opportunities in the new industries, in building all this infrastructure, in building the power plants which are green and climate friendly. That is the new source of the new and modern jobs for a lot of people. So yes, I am concerned it goes too slowly, but at the same time it's absolutely possible, and if we mobilize the resources we have, and I'm impressed what the US and EU has done so far, then we will be able to do something that really makes a difference.
Okay, thank you very much. So, over to you. I have to admit that GMF have provided an absolutely impossible thing, which is something called a throwbox microphone, which relies on something extremely unreliable, which is both my capacity to pitch things and also your capacity to catch. Right, so I'm actually going to rely on microphones that come to you. There is the box. But if you wish to try out the box, you're welcome. So I can't see you super well, but okay. So we'll take the first question just next to the box there, or you could just give the microphone.
Work?
That's it.
There we go.
Well done.
Do I get to throw it back as well?
Well, I think that was the idea, but I wouldn't recommend it.
No, fine. Henry Foy at the Financial Times. A number of you have made remarks, and I'm going to pull together into one question. Obviously, climate change is a global issue, and if one country doesn't deal with it and the others do, it means we all suffer, and the Arctic is a big problem. Would any of you like to give me an answer as to how much you think the fight against climate change has been set back by the war in Ukraine and the inability now of the West to engage with Russia on climate change, which was one of the few areas where Moscow still did talk to Washington and Brussels and other capitals. And how do we deal with that, given that this war could go on for a very long time, Russia could remain a pariah state for a very long time, but we must engage with them on climate change, especially in the Arctic? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take 3 questions in this round. So could you, the woman who's here in the middle of this row, there you go.
Thank you very much. Manon Dufour from E3G. Thanks a lot for, I feel very privileged to witness this conversation. We've talked a lot about, you've talked a lot about the climate security impacts, like globally, and like talked about food security and migration, the Sahel, the Arctic. I wonder to what extent you're also looking at kind of the internal cohesion, whether it's in the EU or the US, where clearly Southern Europe will be impacted very differently to Northern Europe. I'm sure it's very similar in the US, and to what extent this could actually lead to more challenges, security or else, for like unity, territorial integrity, really. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And just here. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm having secretly reporting for Arab Emirates TV, which will held the COP next year. My question is about damage and loss and damage. Do you think that this COP will be? How much are you optimistic for regarding this issue, cost and damage? And how are your expectations, general expectation, with this COP, in Arab country and in fuel producer country? Thank you.
Okay, so quick fire round on expectations for the COP, especially on loss and damage, differential impact of climate change across different countries, and the first one, which is about the impact of the war on climate action. So who'd like to pick one of those up? Go ahead.
I can try to be brief on the war. So first of all, of course, wars are bad for many reasons. The most important reason is that people are killed, and it causes a lot of damage and destruction. But then, of course, on top of that, it also makes it harder to move forward on a global agenda and make countries working together. So of course, one consequence of the war is that it's harder to then sit down and talk to Russia about agreements on climate change. But that's in a way, it's a problem, but the main problem is that people are killed every day. Then I think we shouldn't overstate or exacerbate or overstate the consequences, because Russia was not so very concerned about climate change before the war. So I don't think so I think maybe Frans and others can say something about that. But my impression is that they have not been very focused on the climate change agenda. Even before the war. The last thing is to say that, of course, one of the reasons why peace is so important and why NATO really regard our most important task is to preserve peace and security is that if we have big conflicts between big powers and less stability and security, then of course we are less able to make agreements like the Paris Accord. And of course, if we are not able to, for instance, engage with China because we are in some kind of worsened situation with them, that will be a big problem, because we need to have China on board in addressing climate change.
Thank you very much.
About the war, because the other issues, I'm sure John and Frans can talk with much more capacity. As you said, war is bad for everything, but it certainly is not good for a climate fight. It's the changes on priorities are absolute. So a war, the priority is to win the war. All other issues become later. First, it's true that before the war, Russia was not very much worried about climate. I heard some statement from Russian authorities saying, well, why should we worry? At the end, the climate change is good for us. For us, for Russia, it's good. Our climate will become milder. So they were not very much engaged. Secondly, the war itself creates a lot of CO2 emissions, because the warfare are not being thought in order to save emissions. Third, Russia is not selling its gas. They're not selling its gas to us, and they don't have anyone else to buy the gas, because they don't have pipelines. So they are burning it. They are just burning it. And the satellite shows clearly how the gas fields continue working, because you cannot put a tap in a gas field. The gas continue flowing and being burned. So big emissions of methane to atmosphere. The gas that we don't use is being burned in a great proportion, because there is not another alternative client to the European ones. Then the Nord Stream 2 explosion has created also a lot of emissions of methane. So the war is a very bad news for fighting against climate change. And as far as the war continues, I don't see any way of talking with Russia about climate. You know, we'll say, I have another priorities. The real issue is to be able to talk with China at any moment, because China is burning as much as coal as the rest of the world together. And thank God, by the time being, we can and we should continue talking with China about everything, including climate. But with Russia, I don't see the way of coming and knocking at the door of Kremlin saying, look, what about climate?
So the other two questions were differential impact of climate and also expectations for the COP, at which you will both be representing.
Russia. You'll do Europe. I'll do Russia.
Oh, you want me to start? Well, I think, you know, I am surprised by both the consensus on addressing Russia's aggression in Europe, pleasantly surprised. It's not just a consensus at the political level, there's a very, very strong societal consensus as well, and I think this is something we should be very, very grateful for, and I think it will persist. Secondly, I see the different challenges between North and South in terms of the effects of the climate crisis, but don't underestimate, it's affecting everyone. You know, Finnish forests are now becoming CO2 emitters. And we all have these challenges across the European Union. But the worst challenges, obviously, are in the Mediterranean. I mean, the desertification, the risk of desertification of Spain, and the persistence of very erratic weather patterns in Italy. Why? Because the seas on both sides are heating up very quickly, is something we will have to face as Europeans. And solidarity will have to play a huge role in that. And I frankly don't doubt that we will find that solidarity. I'm not worried about that. If I can say something very briefly about COP, I'm actually optimistic that we can have a successful COP this year. I'm not of those who say we should exclude the oil and gas sector from the COP. I think we need them to understand that they need to change. And you can't get that into their heads if you don't have them at the table. And I think Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber is well placed to play that role together with us. So, you know, I still am, if we, together with the United States, could achieve that there is a real step change in the attitude of global oil and gas at COP, then we would really have achieved a great success at COP. And I think the Emirates and Dr. Sultan can be instrumental in this. Final remark on Russia. The Russians are scared to death about climate change. They are, because it's destroying their oil and gas industry. The disappearance of permafrost is doing a lot of damage. And they're in two minds about this. There's this, you know, Russia has many faults, and you will know me as a critic of them, especially of Putin. But they have a very strong scientific community who are very clear about the challenges to them of the climate crisis. It's affecting their oil and gas industry. It's creating wildfires all across Russia. It's harming their agriculture in a horrible way. They are really, really worried about this. And in the Kremlin, they're in two minds about that. There's one faction that says we need to address this and we need to engage internationally. Sometimes they have the upper hand, like also I believe that was the case in Glasgow, and we could talk to them then. But there's another faction that says it's all bogus, it's all a way to weaken us, they want to hurt us with their climate nonsense, and Putin is listening to the second faction now, not to the first. So having a dialogue with them now seems to me quite impossible. The only thing we need to do is to make sure that they don't win this war and that Ukraine comes out of this victorious.
Obviously, not having Russia at the table is a problem, and it's costly. And prior, in 2021, as we went through 2021, prior to the war starting, I spoke at length with President Putin about Russia's participation, and also I talked to Lavrov, and they agreed to put a pretty competent team together, young, aggressive, and capable folks. And we began a dialogue with them. We thought we had an ability to move, particularly on methane, and particularly on some of their technology in the oil fields and so forth. And then, of course, regrettably, that just got wiped away when the war started. And there's been no communication since then. But I'd ask you all to look at it this way. While we have to make sure we deliver to the global south and that we have development money and that we're doing things that we need to do, remember that 48 sub-Saharan African states equals 0.55% of all the emissions. But 20 countries that are the major economies of the world are almost 80% of all the emissions. 50% of those 20, which I'm happy to say involves Europe, the United States, Australia, Japan, Canada, UK, EU, are legitimately pursuing plans to keep 1.5 alive. The other half of that 20 are not yet there, but some are really trying hard and doing interesting things. China producing a huge amount of renewables, deploying those renewables. India having set a target of 500 gigawatts of deployed renewable by 2030, and they're really pushing hard to make that happen. So really interesting things happening. Mexico, which is one of those 20, has come to the table. They've agreed to do more renewables. Vietnam has signed an agreement, and they're moving on renewables. So if we can continue this effort, I think we can bring a critical mass to the table. And obviously, whether or not the oil and gas industry is going to play different, that's up for grabs now. And what the UAE delivers here is going to be the proof, the proof of the pudding, is whether or not they bring people to the table and change the dynamic. But it certainly has the potential that Frans just described to be a success and to be different from any other up because we've never had that participation. And we're about to meet in Paris for 2 days, tomorrow and the next day, with finance on the table. If we can come up with a new finance structure and mechanism, this could be such a different takeoff platform for the next 7 years. And remember, we don't have to do this all by tomorrow or next week or even this year, as long as we're moving in the right direction to create momentum in these new technologies. I believe we're on the cusp of really doing that. And I'm optimistic because I know what you all do too. You know what human ingenuity is capable of doing. Look at what we did when we had to have vaccines. Look at what we've done historically when we come together. There are so many different things we could put on the table now to make this happen faster, providing we get people to be serious about the nature of the threat. And that is still that question mark that is tied to attitudes, complacency, greed, indifference, skepticism about the transition, fear of the transition, a lot of different feelings out there that we have to try to manage. But I am really hopeful we can, pull this off and get where we need to be.
Thank you. We are out of time, but I would like to just finish with thinking a little bit forward on where we go. We've got COP28 happening shortly, as just discussed. There will be the EU joint communication on climate security at the end of this month. There will also be at the Vilnius summit a NATO communique looking at climate again. So is this a one-off, having all four of you here together? Is this, the first and last time that we'll see such transatlantic unity on the need for action? Or are there ways of operationalizing this and embedding it, not only in security policies, but also in concrete action? It would be very good just to have a quick view from each of you.
Frans and I are getting on a train. We're going together. We're going to have a summit on the train to Paris. And we invite Jens to come along, and we'll make everything change.
So apart from the conversations between the old buddies, how about actually operationalizing this in the policies, in the ways in which the EU and NATO actually do their daily business?
But in many ways, that's already going on. First of all, the United States is a NATO ally. So when we do something in NATO, we do it with the United States, and the United States is actually investing in and working hard to also develop technologies for the armed forces that are greener. They're now looking into how to develop Bradley infantry fighting vehicles that are not based on fossil fuels, but actually electric. So this is part of the efforts that NATO allies are doing, and the United States is part of that. Mm-hmm. Then NATO and the European Union, we have established a task force where we work on resilience, and also the way to address the consequences of climate change is part of that. And most NATO allies most EU members are also NATO allies. When Sweden is a full member, then 96% of the people living in the European Union, they live in a NATO country.
All we need now is for Norway to join.
Yeah, but that's that.
Your next job.
I've tried twice and lost. So that's too hard. My standard line on this, but I stopped doing that for some years ago, is that Norway will become a member of EU long before Sweden becomes a member of NATO, and I was totally wrong.
Now it could be Ukraine.
So we need to work with the close partners like Norway, and then Norway is a member of NATO, and then so the work is in progress. So hopefully we can meet again. But even more important than meetings like this is actually that we go back to our organizations and nations and ensure that we actually are delivering and things are happening.
Yeah, Josep, how can this be operationalized? Just give us a couple of examples.
We need more partnership among us. There is a lot of work to do, which is not very much sexy, will not make any headline in the newspapers. But we need a lot of research, capability development, resilience building, training of our soldiers, modernizing our warfare. There is a lot of work to do for our armies to become more green. Because certainly they are not conceived to be green.
Uniforms are green.
Uniforms or brown.
Depends on the country.
Or brown, no? But it depends on the landscape and on the army. But certainly there is a big work to do that. And there are small things and big things. The small things, allow me to put two examples. I am going to create an satellite analyze climate and security and policy analysis related to that. We can have through our satellites and to make the link between security and climate. Second, in all our CSDP missions, we will embed a climate package. We are all over the world. We are more than 5,000 people deployed around the world, and they have to have a climate package in order to understand and to follow what's going on and how we can support these countries where we are deployed to do more. I know that it's not their priorities, I understand, but it's our priority, and we have to make them to understand how to do. And certainly much more partnership, because we are good partners, but on this specific field, everything is to be done. We haven't started yet.
Thank you. That's
Well,
great.
three years ago, we didn't even know that we needed to develop policy on this. So it's really new. The understanding that security is intimately linked with the climate crisis is relatively new. And what I would like, just to give one example, because we're out of time, if you look back at the last 100 years, there's always been an intimate relationship between security and technological developments. You know, people understood very clearly you need technology to develop new weapons, etc., etc. What we need now is an intimate relationship between security and science on climate. We are not there yet. We need to get the science needs to be part of our security development. And if we get that right, then the response in security terms will be much faster and much more concrete and will actually deliver results. So I would like to have the same nexus you have between technology and defense and security. I would like to see that between the science communities and defense and security.
Okay, so you two need to get on the train to Paris, because the Climate Finance Summit is where the money which is needed to make all of this happen, and particularly to bring human security to the Global South, will be discussed, and looking forward to your contributions there. Thank you all very much. Fantastic to have such a lineup, and thank you very much for your provocative questions.